Hello and welcome to the third in SWET's series of talks on artificial intelligence this fall. I'm Daniel Morales. I'm here in my capacity as a writer and translator, and most of all as a SWET member. I'll be serving as the moderator. I'll go over our agenda and give a brief introduction before we start. First, let me introduce SWET. The Society of Writers, Editors, and Translators is a cross-professional community of Japan-related wordsmiths. Our members include writers, editors, translators, copy editors, copywriters, proofreaders, book designers, teachers, researchers, and rewriters, and many other professions related to the English word. In addition to Japan, SWET members work in many countries around the world. We host numerous events each month, both online and in person, such as our talk shops, Translator Tuesdays, and writer salons. And if there are any events you'd like to see happen or translation topics you'd like to know more about, we'd love to have your ideas and initiative. In 2025, SWET celebrates 45 years as an essential organization for writing and translation in Japan. And if you're not yet a member, please do join us. Membership dues are 6,000 yen a year. Please see our website swet.jp for details on how to join, and that's swet.jp. At the top, I'd also like to thank Lynn Riggs and Richard Sadowski of SWET for their support and patience as we put together these talks, as well as Lisa Wilcutt for helping set up our Zoom. Next, I'd like to introduce the goal of this series of talks. Earlier this year, we had a set of heated discussions on the SWET email list about AI and translation, and this was complicated by two factors. First, it was an email exchange, which allows for the quick exchange of ideas, but can miss nuance at times. We felt like a live event would be more appropriate given the level of interest in the topic. And second, when it comes to AI, there are a multitude of different conversations all happening at once. Should we use AI? If so, to what degree should or can AI be incorporated into translation? How do you actually use AI services? What are the dangers and risks that AI presents that we may not be taking into account? In order to have more productive conversations, we felt like it would be best to divide the topic into multiple sessions to really focus on a single issue at a time. So we'd like to ask everyone to please keep any questions today focused on the topic we're addressing. I've also asked our speakers, and myself included, to focus their ideas by condensing their thoughts into a short number of slides. Today we'll be discussing the risks of AI. So before I introduce the speakers today, we'd like to ask everybody to stay muted during the presentations and note that we will be recording the presentation and discussion to share on YouTube later. Our speakers today are Julia Straatman and myself. For my own introduction, I'll just note that I'm a writer and translator based in Osaka. I've written for the website howtojapanese.com since 2008 and was a contributor to the Japan Times for many years. I run a monthly Japanese reading group and Japanese coaching sessions for the JET Alumni Association 4 times a year. And I also help run SWET's Translator Tuesday events, which meets on the first Tuesday of each month and as a casual place for translators to meet virtually. If you're interested in any of those, please do let me know and I can give you more information. I'll be giving a short presentation on some general risks of AI, ones that SWET will need to engage more subject matter experts on, right before we get to our main presenter today, who is Julia Straatman. Julia is a researcher at the Data School at Utrecht University, where she focuses on digital ethics within Dutch governmental organizations. She has a background in philosophy, ethics, and a specialization in digital ethics. Her research at Utrecht University is focused on developments in data, algorithms, artificial intelligence, and ethics. She is highly involved in the Dutch Fundamental Rights and Algorithms Impact Assessment. She coordinates and carries out assessments involving the instrument and helps Dutch governmental and semi-governmental organizations with practicing digital ethics by providing workshops, lectures, and conducting research in the field. And we're also delighted that she has a close connection with Japan, having studied at Keio University. Thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today, Julia. So on that note, I'll go ahead and start my presentation. Okay. When I started organizing this series of talks, I was hoping that we might be able to locate an expert on the environmental costs of artificial intelligence, because I think that's an area that, first of all, is very important. It's getting a lot of attention these days, but also it's one where SWET does not have expertise. We're translators, we're writers, we're not scientists. This lack of knowledge, I think, has really prevented us from having a real conversation about some of these risks. And unfortunately, we weren't able to track down an environmental expert. But we were able to find Julia, who I think is going to be a really great starting point for an important conversation about ethics in artificial intelligence. But I wanted to at least start grappling with some of the other risks related to AI. And so what I did is I put together information about some of the main risks about environmental and ethical dangers and potential problems of artificial intelligence. I don't think I'll be able to answer questions maybe to the same degree as an expert, but I'll do what I can. And I hope that we can see these as areas that SWET should engage in further in the future. We need to keep working to understand what these technologies mean for these topics. In terms of the environment, I think it's fairly clear that services such as ChatGPT are on a different level than standard Google searches. Google searches are also not completely environmentally neutral. The basic measurement that really gets reported a lot these days is that a ChatGPT query costs 10 times as much as a Google search. So when you ask ChatGPT a question, it uses about 0.0029 kilowatt hours of electricity, which is about 10 times more than what is needed for a Google search, which is 0.0003 kilowatt hours. And this is according to the Electric Power Research Institute. MIT Technology Review did a really detailed, interesting investigation this past May, and they noted that a single query is not really a good measure, given that actual users, when they engage with a chatbot, will have multiple queries for a standard kind of question that they're looking at. The article notes, quote, "You'd use about 2.9 kilowatt hours of electricity, enough to ride over 100 miles on an e-bike or around 10 miles in the average electric vehicle, or run the microwave for over 3.5 hours," unquote. But this research is based on an old form of ChatGPT. They've already released a couple of new versions, and some say that it might be more efficient with the updates, but MIT Technology Review noted that AI companies need to be more forthcoming with how their models work. They said, quote, "We don't know how many parameters are in OpenAI's newest models, how many of those parameters are used for different model architectures, or which data centers are used, and how OpenAI may distribute requests across all these systems. You can guess, as many have done, but those guesses are so approximate that they may be more distracting than helpful. We should stop trying to reverse engineer numbers based on hearsay," Sasha Lucione, an AI researcher from Hugging Face, says, "and put more pressure on these companies to actually share the real ones," unquote. So Lucione goes on to say that few AI companies have opted into the AI energy score, which they developed to measure some of these things. One study from Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health found that the carbon intensity of electricity used by data centers was 48% higher than the US average. We can also couple that with this fact from the same MIT Technology Review article, which is, quote, "ChatGPT is now estimated to be the fifth most visited website in the world, just after Instagram and ahead of X, formerly known as Twitter." In December, OpenAI said that ChatGPT receives 1 billion messages every day. And after the company launched a new image generator in March, it said that people were using it to generate 78 million images per day, unquote. So I think overall, the takeaway is that it's difficult to understand precisely what the energy and environmental impacts will be, but it is clear, one thing that is clear is that in the US at least, there are no local and federal regulations requiring disclosure of energy and water consumption. In terms of water consumption, reporting from the BBC suggests that 10 to 50 responses using the GPT-3 model from OpenAI could consume 500 milliliters of water. And a study from researchers at University of California, Riverside and University of Texas at Arlington suggests that global AI water demand is projected to be 4.2 to 6.6 billion cubic meters of withdrawal in 2027, which is equivalent to the withdrawal of half of the United Kingdom. The researchers in this article as well, they emphasize that AI companies need to be more forthcoming with how they're dividing the load between different data centers. This helps me transition to the next topic, which is that even if the energy costs are not as big a threat as they potentially could be, the costs of producing this energy, of supporting these technologies, are not always distributed equally. For example, xAI's data center in Memphis, Tennessee is one of, I think, the best examples of this. And I encourage you to take some time to watch a video on YouTube from an account called More Perfect Union, demonstrating the specific effects of a single data center on a community. They interview people living near this data center. xAI brought in 35 portable methane gas turbines, despite only being permitted for 15, and they've claimed that only 15 were running. but thermal imaging photos from the Southern Environmental Law Center show that 33 were in use at one time. The effect of these has been clear. It's worsened the environment in an area that's already devastated, that kind of hosts a natural gas plant and a wastewater treatment facility. And because of that, some might say this isn't specifically the fault of XAI, but it's also worse. I'd say this is a community that doesn't have much recourse, and that XAI likely targeted precisely because they knew the community wouldn't be able to fight back. The area around this data center leads Tennessee in emergency department visits for asthma, and a number of people nearby are suffering from COPD. At the same time, Elon Musk has also helped reduce the enforcement of the Clean Air Act and the Environmental Protection Agency during his involvement in the Department of Government Efficiency. Memphis isn't the only example of this. The BBC, in an article, has interviewed residents in Mansfield, Georgia, near a Meta data center, who have seen changes in water quality after the construction of data centers. Often it is rural, poor communities that are forced to support this infrastructure, and the environmental impacts are not the only ones experienced differently by different groups. One example of this is OpenAI's Sora text-to-video feature that was released in October. It was released to great acclaim and was quickly used to make a wide range of different videos. I think one that kind of shows the copyright weakness of AI and the danger of impersonation is this video that got a lot of attention of OpenAI CEO Sam Altman grilling a lifelike version of Pikachu, the most well-known Pokemon. And I think this is obviously a bit silly and maybe could be considered satire at first, but the copyright implications I think are concerning if you were the copyright owner. And if you watch more, it gets a little bit more disturbing as he starts to serve up Pokemon steaks. But other videos I think are a little bit more concerning than and can't be taken as just satire. Influencers in the US have been producing racist videos with false information about food stamps. And recently, the food stamp payments were expired during the government shutdown. And the videos depict Black women, for the most part, talking about how they sell their food stamps for cash or use them to buy iPhones, or even it just shows them getting aggressive with stores that supposedly aren't taking food stamps. Needless to say, this is all fake news and false information. The lack of regulations here for videos like this, I think, does present an equity concern that has the potential to exacerbate racial and class tensions. I did find one example of a law passed in Montana that gives residents the right to their name, image, and likeness, and essentially makes deep fake videos illegal by allowing people to seek damages for them, which would solve one issue with these deepfake videos, these personifying someone else, impersonating somebody else, I should say. But this wouldn't address the racist videos. I think that's something where more regulations will need to be considered as we move forward with AI. I think at this point, the copyright risks of AI are pretty clear to translators in particular. This is the next topic that I want to get into. I'll go over it just briefly. The idea is that AI companies want to use free use, essentially, to upload copyrighted works to train their AI systems so that the systems will give better answers and recreate more accurate content. And recently, there have been some settlements with groups over the use of material. In September, the AI company Anthropic agreed to pay $1.5 billion in a settlement, which the settlement motion calls the largest copyright recovery in history. And more recently, at the end of October, the Universal Music Group, the world's largest music company, settled with the AI music generation platform Udio, although the financial details there have not been disclosed. These may sound like some sort of justice, I think, to the copyright owners, but if you dig a little deeper, it might not be quite as generous. First, in terms of the payment, what does it mean for the writers whose work was used to train Claude, which is Anthropic's AI model? They're getting $3,000 per work that was used, and that's it. As far as I can tell, there's no ongoing usage or licensing payment, no royalties. And the only reason this settlement was paid in the first place is because the books that Anthropic used to train their AI were pirated. They were not legally acquired. If they had legally acquired the 7 million books that they pirated, a judge ruled that it would have been fair use, at least in Northern California. That's what the implication of that case is. It's still, I think, a little bit of a concern there in terms of how copyright is being treated. The Authors Guild commented on the settlement and it said that this settlement marks the beginning of a necessary evolution towards a legitimate market-based licensing scheme for training data, which I think points to the music industry as a potential example. When music went fully digital in the early 2000s, there needed to be a paradigm shift with licensing that has allowed for the current streaming platforms. Universal Music Group is in a much stronger position than the handful of writers who brought the suit against Anthropic. So we'll need to watch how these licensing agreements are put together and whether translators are included at all. I think many of us know how difficult it can be for translators even to keep the copyright of the material that they work on. This is another area that SWET should continue to watch and, if possible, invite experts to get more information about so that translators understand exactly what it is they're supporting when they use AI and where this knowledge is coming from. And then also so that they know better how they can advocate for the copyright of the work that they are producing. The fourth risk I want to address is another area that I am not an expert in, but do think is something that we could look into further, which is the risk of an economic bubble, the potential for this investment in these technologies to crash and have larger effects on the economy. There's been a lot of reporting on this recently about the way the finances between all these technology companies are heavily interrelated and about the companies overpromising on new technology. Just last week, based on Microsoft's $4.1 billion loss related to investments in OpenAI, analysts have said that OpenAI's net loss could be greater than $12 billion. So these are still not profitable technologies largely. Wired also noted at the end of October that in an article, they discussing the potential bubble with authors Brent Coldfarb and David Kirsch from the University of Maryland. These are the authors of the book Bubbles and Crashes, The Boom and Bust of Technological Innovation. They create a system to evaluate bubbles based on four factors. The first is uncertainty, how certain a technology is or is not likely to deliver on its promise. A pure play, which is how tightly connected a company's economic performance is to a single technology. The third is novice investors, or how retail investors are responding to the technology. And lastly is the narrative behind the technology, or the story that companies are selling. And in all cases, AI does seem to fit the definition of a bubble. Uncertainty has not decreased over the past few years. 95% of companies using generative AI have not profited from it. From a pure play perspective, Microsoft, OpenAI, and NVIDIA are increasingly tied together and tied to this single technology. 58% of venture capital has gone to AI in 2025 so far. Novice investors are piling into NVIDIA. It was the single most bought equity by retail traders in 2024 and currently represents 8% of the stock market. And the narrative provides, I think, a seductive story of the infinite, the idea that artificial general intelligence will be able to do anything that a human can do. It's a major concern that we currently seem to be staking a good portion of our economy on, and one that I think is open for more research and for us to dig into deeper. And for the last slide, I want to think more broadly about AI's legacy 100 years from now by looking back 100 years in the past. And I'm going to assume that people here don't recognize these two people in the picture, and I'll introduce them. The first is Mary Ward. She's an Irish woman who was born to a scientific family in 1827. And because her family was so engaged in science, she was fortunate to have a detailed home education at a time when women weren't accepted at universities. She was one of only three women on the mailing list for the Royal Astronomical Society, the others being Queen Victoria and Mary Somerville, a well-known scientist. She was interested in astronomy and microscopes, drawing insects, and she self-published a book called Sketches with the Microscope, which then earned her a contract with a London publisher. This man is Henry H. Bliss. We know less about him and his legacy than we do Mary, but we know that he was an American. He was born in 1830 and that he was a real estate dealer in New York City. As you can imagine, there's something that ties these two together, and that is tragedy. And not the same tragedy, though. So on August 31st, 1869, Mary Ward was riding in an experimental, homemade, steam-powered automobile that was built by her cousin's sons. She was thrown from the car during a turn in the road, fell under the wheels, and died immediately when her neck was broken. She is the first known death from an automobile accident in the world. And likewise, Henry Bliss is the first American to die in a traffic accident. Almost exactly 30 years later, on September 13th, 1899, Henry was stepping down from a streetcar on 8th Avenue and was struck by an electric taxi that was trying to avoid a large truck on the right side of the road. Henry fell and hit his head. He was taken to the hospital, but died from his injuries the next day. So why do I bring these two up? I think that cars are an extremely interesting comparison to AI for a lot of reasons. Obviously, the metaphor isn't perfect. Car violence does not correspond completely with the dangers of and risks of artificial intelligence. People estimate that 100 million people have died in automobile accidents since cars were invented. And I'm not trying to suggest that AI will cause this level of physical violence, but I do think that AI has the potential to remake society in a lot of the ways that cars have remade the way we navigate cities, the way we navigate our countries. And also, it mirrors automobile development and the lack of regulation at the early stages. I think that those points are make an interesting comparison. Also, there have been a number of different lawsuits filed against OpenAI as recently as this past Thursday in California. In some cases, the AI chatbot they make has assisted users in finding ways to commit suicide. And the lawsuits also state that they prey on vulnerable individuals and potentially cause mental health crises. Again, I don't think the potential level for like human violence and danger is the same, but the potential to remake things without many safeguards in place is concerning. So we've had 100 years of very gradual road safety improvements, from seatbelt laws to airbags and stoplights. But I think it's clear that ideally these would have been in place from the beginning. The question is, what can we do now to put into place safeguards for AI? So thank you all for listening today. I think it will be incumbent on individuals and organizations like SWET to look into the risks of these technologies. So hopefully this presentation can be seen as a starting point. If you know of any experts who might be able to present on these topics in more detail, please let me know. And on that note, I will unshare my screen and invite Julia to come forward and give us her insight into AI and algorithm in public organizations.
Yes, thank you so much. It was a very interesting talk. I hope my talk will be complimentary. All right. Yes, let's get into it. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I already got introduced very beautifully by Daniel, but just to briefly reiterate, my name is Straatman, and I am a researcher in digital ethics, and I am an education coordinator at Data School Utrecht University. The Data School is a teaching and research platform situated within Utrecht University, and we concern ourselves with how technology influences society. My job is that I help mostly governmental organizations with implementing algorithms and AI effectively and ethically. So through my work, I get to see a wide variety of interesting use cases. So how that works in practice is that I'm at the university and organizations, they ask for me and some team members to come in and look at a case that they have. So this can be an algorithm, this can be an AI system, it could be both. And they want us to help them guide them through this ethical decision-making process. So they want us to help them assess whether they have missed any ethical blind spots, whether there are some action points that they weren't aware of, and we help them be aware of that. I was asked to present some of the ethical challenges of AI and algorithms through the lens of public administration, so I hope that these topics will offer some food for thought. A little side note, I am speaking from my professional experience, but this talk is in a personal capacity. So that's good to note. Another small note is that I am a little bit sick. I hope you don't hear it too much in my voice, but if I cough or sniffle a bit in between, then that's why. All right, so to get into it. I'm from the Netherlands and I work in the Netherlands, which is nice for my work because in the Netherlands, algorithm use is already pretty far in public administration. I work together with governmental organizations to facilitate responsible AI, and this concerns performing these types of impact assessments. Usually employees are pretty excited about that. It's also a fun process, but sometimes we also get like critical questions like, hey, I used to perform a certain task by human labor, so we still had errors and biases when we did it with just people. So now when we suddenly want to use algorithms, now we have to adhere to these higher standards and we have to do all this bureaucratic load of impact assessments. Why now? Why not when we were just doing it with people? This is because the use of algorithms and AI introduces three new key dimensions as opposed to human work, which is that algorithms work at a much larger scale. They bring about an air of objectivity, and what that is, I'll get into later. And they operate at a much higher speed than people can. For each of these points, I want to briefly introduce three use cases from public administration to illustrate. So first, let's talk about how algorithms work at a much larger scale than only people. And I want to talk briefly about the childcare benefit scandal of the Dutch tax administration. When you talk about algorithm use and scandals in regards to the Netherlands, the first thing that pops up is the childcare benefit scandal. This was huge in my country. To briefly introduce this case, when you are a parent and you have young children, you can apply for grants, like allowances, to get some extra money for childcare, which is nice. However, the government also wanted to make sure that people weren't being fraudulent with it, like only the people that were up for those grants actually got it. So they wanted to use algorithms to see which people were potentially being fraudulent. But this was a deeply flawed system, which is how this scandal broke. So this system used very rigid automated fraud detection with zero tolerance rules. And it wrongfully labeled many families, especially those with double nationalities, as being fraudulent when they were just making some minor administrative errors. The system itself was pretty flawed already. For example, they automatically flagged parents with double nationalities as indicators for fraudsters. But it was not just the system itself, also the organizational culture in the tax administration exacerbated this problem. There was a lack of oversight, there was a lack of transparency, and there was an inability for whistleblowers to make appeal or to bring these problems to light. So all of this allowed bureaucratic automation to lead to a high scale of injustice. And I have some bullet points on the slide that indicate this high scale. There were over 41,000 parents that were wrongfully required to repay childcare allowances, which is an enormous number. And the repayments were so high that they resulted in financial difficulties and in some cases, children being taken away from home. And keep in mind, this was unjustly so. This was not a right decision to be made. When this story finally broke, the government actually fell because of it, because it was such a big scandal, and the tax administration was fined a huge fine. Despite all of the ethical arguments, like flagging double nationality parents as risks for fraudsters, which is crazy in itself, there's also a big economical argument to be made for this case, because the repayments that were then had to be made to those parents have now totaled to 3.2 billion euros. That's a huge amount of money that has to be repaid now. And this does not weigh up against potential fraudsters that would not have been caught if this system didn't operate. So even if you take away all the ethical sides, if you look at it purely economically, using a different system that maybe allowed more fraudsters would be economically more beneficial than having this extremely rigid system that caught many people unjustly. So yeah, this was the big scandal in the Netherlands. And we can see that if you use an algorithm at such a large scale, like nationwide, the problems get bigger and bigger. All right, moving on to the second case, algorithms can have this air of objectivity. And I want to illustrate this with the second use case, which is student grant fraud by the Education Executive Agency. I will probably call it the agency from now on because it's a little bit of a mouthful, but you get what I mean. What do I mean with an air of objectivity? What I mean by that is that if an algorithm or an AI produces a certain result or gives a certain recommendation, people tend to take it more seriously than when a person says it. And this can pose risks, right? Because it gives this certain mask of objectivity to certain outputs that may not be as objective as you may think. So to present this use case, in the Netherlands, if you're a student and you live away from your parents, you can apply for a certain grant. So you get some money from the government because you live away from home, get a little allowance. In this case as well, it's again fraud related. The education agency wanted to see or detect students who were being fraudulent with this grant. And what does it mean to be fraudulent? It meant that you still lived with your parents, but you stated to the agency that you lived away from home at a certain address while you were actually still living with your parents. So you could apply for the grant while you weren't allowed to get the grant because you still live with your parents. You're only allowed to get the grant if you live away from your parents. So they were trying to detect the fraudsters in this system. How do you do that? How do you detect who says they live away from home, but they don't actually live away from home? They try to automate this process by making an algorithm. How did they make this algorithm? It's actually surprisingly subjective. They just had a small group of employees from the agency who were in a workshop one afternoon, and they just determined with each other what the risk factors are that a student is being fraudulent with this grant. So the risk factors that were determined were the age of the student and the distance that they supposedly lived away from their parents. Why? We don't know. Gut feeling. That's probably it, because there was no scientific ground and no validation being done. So what they determined to be risk factors for fraud was that the younger you are, the more likely you were to be fraudulent with this grant. And the closer you said you lived to your parents, the more likely you were to be fraudulent. So their reasoning probably was like, I am a 17-year-old student and I just moved away a kilometer away from my parents, and I apply for the grant and it says, oh, I'm 17 and I live a kilometer away from my parents. The agency probably decided that was a risk factor for being fraudulent, because why would you live away from your parents if it's so close by? If you only live a kilometer away, why not stay with your parents then? I guess that was the assumption, but there was no scientific ground. There was no technical validation. There was also another risk factor, by the way, which was education level. Your further, like your after high school education, when it was university level, you were lower on the risk score of being a fraudster, which sounds bad. It is bad. And the lower your education level, like the more practical education that you received, the higher your risk factor was. So that was another bias that was just inserted into the system. So taking all these risk factors combined, you get the sheet that is on this slide. So unfortunately, the sheet is in Dutch, but to guide you through it, I think the colors speak for itself. But we have the distance to parents column. That's the most left row, the most left row. Oh no, column, I do mean column, sorry. So the most left column is the distance to parents in meters. The column next to it is age. So we have 15 to 18, 19 to 20, etc. And then after that, you have risk scores, which are subsequently divided into education levels. So those MBO and HBO and WO, those are education levels. WO being the highest education and MBO 1, 2 being the lowest education. So we can see, if I were a student that was 17 years old and I lived a kilometer away from my parents, let's say I was MBO 3 education level, I would have a risk score of 110, which is extremely high risk for being a fraudster. Why? Just because of these factors that were just decided by a group of employees. And why does this matter? Because those that were labeled very high risk were subjected to house controls. Employees from the executive agency, they were sent to the houses that you supposedly lived in, and they would search your house to make sure that you lived there. So they would look for signs that you were actually living there. So how does your bedroom look? Does it look lived in? How does your bathroom look? Does it have care products for your hair or something? Very invasive. So this story broke eventually, and was rightfully so very much criticized. And there was a technical validation being done eventually, and no connections were found between these factors. So age and distance from parents were not connected to being a fraudster, even though they employed the system to work as such. Now, it was also judged by the Data Protection Authority that this was discriminative. Why was it discriminative? Because distance to parents very closely correlated with being a student with a migration background. Why? Because students with migration backgrounds just tended to live closer to home than other students. So this system picked for about 98% students with migration backgrounds from it. So only almost only students with migration backgrounds were subjected to these very invasive home searches, all the while the system didn't even work properly because a lot of students went into appeal and the appeal was granted. So they were told by the judge, no, you are not a fraudster, even if the agency said you were. We can already see how deeply flawed this system was. But the problem is when you put this into an algorithm like they did, even if it's just a simple algorithm, it appears to be more objective because the system says so. When you present it as a small group of employees from the education agency said so, yeah, that sounds a lot less objective. But the algorithm says so, sounds a lot more objective. So that was a big problem. So I will just briefly go through this last case. This is a pretty recent case as well. So algorithms also operate at a very much higher operation speed. And we have another example from the tax administration because they have a rap sheet of doing not great, unfortunately. So the Dutch tax administration has more than 100 algorithms for determining which tax returns and applications are up for further inspection. So as a proper citizen, you always do your tax returns and you keep your administration in order. But the tax administration wants to check more closely at some cases to see whether, well, errors were made or, again, if fraud was detected. And more than half, not more than half, exactly half of these systems, algorithms were deemed to be discriminatory and therefore unlawful, according to the Data Protection Authority. This was because these systems used selection criteria that they couldn't justify. They were, again, just based on practices or opinions from people, and they really interfered with people's rights to know why they were being selected for further inspection. It was not an A-select criteria, it was like very selected, but they didn't know why they were being selected and what criteria were used and why those criteria were used. And that's a problem. It infringes upon your right to proper administration. Some of these algorithms even make decisions without any human intervention. So we can see that the speed, also in combination of scale of these algorithms, means that this is a problem that grows very quickly. So the conclusion right now, we don't know what is going to happen with this case, but right now the conclusion is that possibly millions of these decisions based on these selection criteria algorithms may be illegal. I say may because this is still an ongoing story and we don't know yet how this is going to turn out. But we can see there are a lot of consequences by optimization if errors slip in. The scale and the speed of it can make it grow very quickly. So while all of the aforementioned points also apply to AI systems, the funny thing is that all of the use cases I just presented to you are not AI, actually. They are pretty simple algorithms, especially in the education agency case. It's literally an Excel sheet, like what on that sheet is literally the whole algorithm. What I'm trying to say with that is that low complexity is not a golden ticket towards responsible AI. Sometimes people tend to think, oh, it's not complex, I can explain it, thus it is responsible. That's not unfortunately the case. But the same way goes the other way around as well. You can have a very complicated AI system that is not bad. For example, weather systems are very complicated AI systems, but they're not very high risk in terms of the impact on an individual's life. I have this little systemic graph for you to show you that while AI systems always fall in the category of algorithms, algorithms are not always AI systems. So examples of AI systems are chatbots, recommender systems, translation tools, facial recognition, etc. You can see it on the slide. So in my work, I don't really care too much about the technical distinction between algorithms and AI systems. What I care a lot more about is the impact that a piece of technology can have, as opposed to those technical qualities. So to end with some takeaways, algorithmization, while amplifying human biases, bring about their own sets of problems in terms of scale, speed, and this era of objectivity. However, doing nothing wrong or not using technology at all is not realistic. There are a lot of examples of technology being a lot of good, also in public administration, by the way. I don't have the time to go into it deeply, but do ask me if you want some examples. Again, I just point this out, but low complexity does not equal responsible technology, the same way that high complexity does not equal harmful technology. The context matters. What is the organizational culture that a piece of technology operates in? We saw this with the tax administration and the childcare benefit scandal, that while the system itself was deeply flawed, the culture of the tax administration greatly exacerbated the problem. So if that culture were different in the tax administration, we can wonder, maybe the problems would have been flagged earlier. Awareness is the first step. Being aware of how technology can help you and being aware of the possible pitfalls that it has is always the first step in any organization that I step into. Oh, whoops. And always remember, this is probably the most important one, always remember that technology is the tool to achieve something and never the goal in itself. Like, always ask yourself, what is the goal you're trying to achieve? And is this piece of technology the way to achieve that goal? All right, I think I went a little bit over my 15 minutes, but I would like to thank you, and I look very much forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Julia. That was really interesting. Just to start with the questions, I'm curious to know about what is your approach when you start to work with an organization that wants to use an AI or an algorithm? What are some of the first questions you ask them when you're starting that process?
Yeah, good question. I can only speak from public administration, but the attitude that some organizations have is that they have to do something with AI. They feel like they're otherwise falling behind. We see this particularly with smaller municipalities who don't have the manpower or the money to do a lot of crazy stuff, but they want to do something because they feel like they're falling behind. The first thing we want to do is to nip that in the bud, because it's definitely not true that you have to do the most complicated AI system to stay relevant or something. For us, the most relevant question is, what are you trying to achieve and what's the problem you're trying to solve? And is AI the right way to solve that problem? That's really the first step. And it sounds very deceivingly easy, but we see in practice that this just gets skipped over and people just start doing whatever because they feel like they have to, or otherwise they're falling behind, without taking that end goal into account. What problem are you solving, and are you actually solving it with this piece of technology? And there are definitely a few steps that come after that, but I'm not sure how deep you want me to go.
No, that's a really interesting approach. I think especially for translators thinking about like what exactly are they trying to do with a translation tool? Individual translators, yeah, a company might be a different level, but yeah, that's very interesting. I'll open up to, I have other questions, but I also wanted to open it up to anybody else who's joined us. I don't know if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask. You can, I think, use the raise your hand feature or ask it in the chat, and then I can call on you. Does anybody have any questions? Well, I can go to my other one. Let's see. I'm also curious about you. I feel like you might know more about what's currently happening in terms of regulations. What are you seeing in the Netherlands and the EU in terms of what public organizations are required to do when using AI and algorithms?
It's definitely. So in the EU, we have the AI Act right now, which is the first major piece of legislation regarding the topic of AI. And I'm very happy that we have that right now. And it throws a lot of new perspectives, a lot of new obligations as well for organizations. In terms of the EU AI Act, they have decided to regulate AI systems, and they use this with a risk-based approach. The first thing you have to do is you have to analyze which AI systems are not really risky, or they're low risk, medium risk, high risk, or unacceptable risk. It's this risk pyramid that they're operating from. There's certain unacceptable risks of AI systems, like social credit scores or like emotional manipulation systems. Those are just downright forbidden, so you cannot use them at all. The most interesting category is the high risk AI systems. So those are AI systems that concern like crucial facets of society, access to employment, education, critical infrastructure. There are a few more. And systems that operate in that context, those are labeled high risk, and they have to conform to a lot more demands. So they have to do a fundamental rights impact assessment. They have to do some technical conformity assessments. And one thing I do want to point out is that this entire EU AI Act only concerns AI systems. So these cases that I just mentioned to you, the childcare benefit scandal, the education agency, those are algorithms. Those are not AI systems. They would not be covered by this piece of legislation, which is a great shame. It's the biggest flaw in the AI Act that I personally think there is, because these cases have had such a huge societal impact, but they are not complicated enough to fall under the AI Act. The next question is why? Why is it only AI systems that are covered? This is just straight up lobbying from big tech organizations. Yeah, that's the only answer I have. So that's very unfortunate. But if you do qualify as an AI system, and you're high risk, then you have a lot of conformity assessments and fundamental rights assessments that you have to adhere to.
Understood. That's fascinating. So that's regulating it actually at the level of the actual company, not an organization using the AI. So this, I think we've seen one thing that comes to mind is the way that the EU has different requirements for they that have changed the way that Apple has been selling their product. USB-C
Yeah.
is now standard. And so is it something, do you think that something like this could have ripples internationally?
Yeah, I definitely think so, because in the EU AI Act, there are different obligations for providers and deployers. So providers would be the companies that are like supplying the AI systems, and deployers are the ones using it. So, for example, if the Dutch government uses an AI system that's made by a big tech company, then the government would be I need to say it right now, would be the deployer, while the company would be the provider. And there are different demands for each of those. And because the big tech companies are also affected by these AI Act, I do think that it can ripple outwards. It can also have some negative effects on the way this piece of legislation is being deployed right now, because there have been some concerning calls for delaying the implementation of the AI Act, because big tech companies are claiming that it's too hard to adhere to, which is just not true. They're claiming that it's too difficult. They have to change so many projects. User experience will go back if they have to adhere to all these rules. It's not true. It's just not true. They just don't want to do it. Costs more time.
Yeah, it does. It reminds me a lot of the comments that you hear related to the copyrighted works, and it were companies saying that if they weren't able to use copyrighted works, then it wouldn't be for free, then it wouldn't be financially feasible for them to train it at all, which kind of, I think, maybe goes to show that if you're not able to produce something profitable without getting the basic source of what makes your product for free, then maybe there's some questions about whether it should be made at all.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
definitely.
something to look into going forward, I think, especially for translators, especially with copyright issues with and things like that. Susan, yes.
Hi, yeah, I have a couple of questions and comments, but thank you both very much for your thought-provoking presentations, especially a voice from the EU. I'm not as familiar with what's been happening there, so I was really interested to hear about those case studies that you mentioned coming from the EU. I'm wondering what kind of regulations exist, if any, regarding AI usage disclosure. And I'm asking this from a personal level. It occurred to me today. I was just having a discussion with my husband. He mentioned a video, and I said, "Oh, that's a fake. That's not that's made by
Mm,
AI." He said, "Yeah, but it's still
mm,
amusing." I said, "But is it?" I said, "I don't want to waste my time on fake AI videos that might try to lead me down a way of thinking that I don't agree with. I mean, that you could call that deep fakes and stuff like that as well. But even videos that aren't inherently that are made just for entertainment purposes, I still want to know personally, on a personal level,
yes.
what content is made by AI and what content is not made by AI. But that's a bigger question too. How far do companies or governments have to disclose how far they're using AI for their content or for their operations? Are there any
Yeah.
regulations?
Yeah, they are actually. So that's really good to know. Good question. In the AI Act, so generative AI and general purpose AI, like video creation, etc., those are categorized as limited risk. So you have that risk pyramid in the AI Act: unacceptable, high risk, limited risk, and no risk. Those systems that you mentioned are limited risk. Whether you agree with that or not is a different question. But when it is limited risk, you have transparency obligations. Those providers have the obligation to say, this is AI. They have to say that when the AI Act comes into force. So the AI Act has come into force in phases. I'm not sure when the limited risk obligations get enforced, but they will be obliged to be transparent about that it is AI. I don't know what form yet. I don't know if it has to be like a watermark or if it's in like the metadata only. I'm not sure about that, but there will be a transparency obligation. Yes.
I hope that we do see a cascade effect that Daniel was asking about a little bit ago. Will there be an effect from that AI Act in the
Yeah,
EU? I certainly hope so because it's
I hope
getting
so too.
really frustrating,
Yeah,
not just on a personal level, but I also teach. So it's getting harder and harder for me to help students understand dependable resources, not dependable resources, that sort of thing. How
yeah,
far can they use AI? Do they need to let me know if they're using AI? That sort of thing. These are questions I'm struggling with every week, and it's getting harder and harder. Yeah, it's just making life really difficult. The other thing
yes.
you mentioned that I wanted to just highlight was this phrase you used, that algorithms present an air of objectivity. And I think we can say the same thing about generative AI.
Yeah,
It seems objective, it seems unbiased, it's coming from a machine. But of course,
yeah,
we know that it's not. It's very biased. And this is perhaps one of the most difficult things. You almost have to keep telling yourself, repeating to yourself as you use AI, saying, oh, wait, it's created with bias and it's also created to give us a positive feedback. So if you're just a general user of ChatGPT or other generative AI, the very first sentence is almost always a compliment. Oh,
yeah,
well, you wrote that very well, or you translated that very well, but I might make a few suggestions. Here are my suggestions. But always comes back with something supportive. Its inclination is to give you this positive feedback, and that's not always a good thing. I think
definitely.
your phrase that you used, it presents an air of objectivity that we have to be very suspicious of.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, I'm
Yeah.
glad you agree. And yeah, that definitely applies to AI systems as well, particularly so in those chatbots. Like it's literally programmed into them to be kind and be agreeable. And that's something to take into account when you're like bouncing ideas off of it. It will always agree with you, even if you have the worst ideas ever. Yeah, and there, yeah, and there was this phase, I think it's better now, but there was this phase where you could convince it of something that was false, and it would
Yes.
just yeah, it would just agree with you because it's programmed to be agreeable. Yeah, yeah. So that's yeah, it's also a human psychology thing. When a computer says something, we just believe it. When it's a number, we tend to agree with it more instead of it's a text. It's the same thing with something as basic as getting a grade in school. You get a 9 out of 10. It's assumed that you know the material well. Is that so? Did you really do the material well? Or did you like guess properly? Or how, yeah, like that's also an algorithm. Like, how do you assess tests? But the moment it says a 9 out of 10, you're like, wow, that student must really get it, even though. How do you know? How do you measure understanding? Yeah, it's a weird thing. Yeah, I'm musing now, but yeah,
Yeah, thank you.
yeah,
And speaking of ripple effects, one thing that comes to mind is the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, which I think started in the EU. I can't remember exactly when, but I can speak from my personal experience working at a nonprofit association in Chicago in from 2018 to 2021, and that was a major topic. That was something where we were putting into place protections for people's data and things like that, and is now fairly universal, I would say, even for something as simple as somebody writing online with a website where you're able to take someone's comments, where you're collecting something as simple as their email address. They recommend putting in a statement of some kind, acknowledging how you're handling the data. Just so this idea that maybe that's an optimistic way to look at it, that we've solved these problems in the past and that we can do similar things moving forward. So I think I hope my presentation wasn't too negative, but maybe something to think about. But I see that Mike now has his hand up. Please go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that was a very interesting presentation, and I completely agree with you that some of the examples that you presented were more on the algorithm side than what you might call AI by the modern interpretation, although, as you probably know, a lot of those algorithms came out of the AI world over time. Looking at them, you can look at some obvious flaws at the beginning that go under the heading of feature selection, especially that educational grant thing. Obviously, there was not enough validation of the features, but we that's not what I'm trying to say. As you get into AI, one of the weird miracles, what I call the black magic of AI, is the feature selection happens during the training, and you don't know the features a priori. They emerge from the training algorithm just as the results do, which makes it impossible to do any kind of a priori analysis. And that's where I'm going with this is this just idea popped into my head while I was listening to you. Maybe where we need to be looking in terms of validation and safety and stuff like that is, and I hate to use the pharmaceutical industry as an example of anything. In that industry, there's a certain validation methodology where you roll out tests to a restricted population, and if that works okay, you expand the population, and then you start rolling it out to the general population. With something that's too complex to model the effects internally in any reasonable way, that may be all you're left with. And that's probably all I wanted to say, is that maybe we should be thinking about those drug protocols and testing and qualification methodologies, which I don't know much about myself, as our best approach to anything where these things are used in public administration, tax administration, or anything like that. So that's all I wanted to say.
A good comment. Thank you for your comment. Yeah. Yeah, it is a lot more difficult the more complex the system becomes, because you cannot, like you said, always know why they're making certain selections. And it's very important for those systems to, like, if you want to implement a system like that, to have a safe space to practice with it. The EU AI Act also allows for what they call regulatory sandboxes. They mean these safe spaces where you can test run these kinds of systems without immediately having this big effect on people, on real people. So yeah, good comment.
Yeah. I think that's probably going to be one of the ways we have to go.
Yeah, I agree.
Go ahead, Susan. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. So just going off of what Michael just said and going back to what Daniel, you told us about in your section, it feels generative AI is being released and updated en masse around the world constantly, and we are the guinea pigs. There is no small scale test, and the price we're paying is actually in human lives now, as Daniel pointed out, with examples of people who have been led to take their own lives. And I think I was reading or listening to a podcast, I can't remember which at this point, about one of those lawsuits. And in that lawsuit, it's the parents who were of the 17-year-old in the United States who took his own life, and they were suing OpenAI because there were guardrails built into the system such that if you were having suicidal ideation and you typed in certain words or certain phrases, it would automatically just refer you to your closest hotline or help center or whatever. It would stop the interaction basically. But it only did that for their son, their 17-year-old son, 30% of the time, when they analyzed his whole ChatGPT history, the whole history of him interacting with it regarding this one issue. And to me, that's, if you take Michael's example of the pharmaceutical industry, would they continue to release to larger and larger populations if they only had a 30% success rate with a new drug? That's almost inconceivable, isn't it? I don't know anything about the pharmaceutical industry, but it seems like they're a little more cautious than that. That's insane.
That is insane. Like, these guardrails, it's also really easy to get around these guardrails. Like, I assume that sometimes you don't get around them intentionally, but you have these guardrails if you're not allowed to ask how to make a bomb or something. But if you ask hypothetically, or I want to write a book about someone building a bomb, how would I describe it? It's very easy to get around the guardrails. And if you don't use the right phrasing, even if it's not intentional on your side, you might not run into the guardrails. And I think it's a really interesting case you're bringing up, because this was also a case in the Netherlands that ChatGPT referred people too quickly to the suicide hotline. And the Dutch suicide hotline couldn't handle it because there were too many people being referred to them. And they didn't have the capacity to deal with all those people, especially because actually a lot of the people that did call the suicide hotline as a response to ChatGPT, they were not in a right space, but they were not suicidal. So then the suicide hotline couldn't necessarily help them, which would then have a bad ripple effect of them probably not getting help again because they were being denied by the hotline. So it's a very sad case. Yeah.
In the end, we're all the guinea pigs in this great AI experiment. the moment. It's really
Yeah.
Yeah.
sobering.
And I do think that one issue that I didn't touch on is it does seem like there's something beyond, obviously, the impersonating people, that I think there's gradually going to be a rolling out of laws pretty widely preventing that, which I think is a good thing. But in terms of the other videos, I think there will be cases made for free speech for them, which is going to be difficult. But I think it speaks to other challenges that we're facing in terms of the social media environment, which are a bit separate from AI in terms of how information is getting passed around, which is probably like worsening some of these issues in terms of the equity issues that I discussed. I don't think that's quite as simple as being able to regulate that out of these AI models and things like that. So it's going to be a real challenge, I think. It's something that we'll have to pay attention to, I think. So,
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think another dimension is that even if there's a law against these deep fakes or impersonation, it will be impossible to regulate because if you do it at such a large scale, how are you going to get everyone? And these
yeah.
AI systems also create some sort of accountability gap because you want to maybe approach the companies that allow those types of systems to operate, but they're going to be like, I didn't make the deep fake, the user did that. So how do you address that accountability gap? That's also a big issue. Yeah.
I make a little bit of content for my students that I upload to YouTube. And one of the questions when I'm uploading a video is, was any of this content created by AI? And usually I click no because it's not. But I was specifically talking about AI in one of my videos, and some of the images I used to explain what is a deep fake were created by AI. And so I clicked yes, and it put a watermark. It flagged it as being partially AI created when you see that video online, but it's totally user reported. They didn't detect any AI themselves. So it's
Yeah.
like you said, there's a huge accountability gap there.
I'm seeing a comment from Marty real quick. Let me read that out and then we'll go to Mike. But Marty says, both talks have been absolutely fascinating. Thank you. I'm so glad people like yourself, Julia, are involved in improving the use of AI in the public sphere. I hope we have similar expert helping us in the UK. I fear that scandals like those you highlighted might be prevalent in many countries and often completely unknown to the public. I feel that your talk really flags up the need for more research, scrutiny, and also, in my opinion, a free press, the right to ask questions. We have a Freedom of Information Act in the UK. This must be upheld by the courts and strongly applied. So yeah, I would agree. Yeah, no, thanks so much. I think it really shed the light on things that may not be obvious at first. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that comment.
Yeah. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, just a real quick comment. When you get into this question of any kind of regulations and enforcement, you run very quickly into the fact that there's an international angle to it too. And that is, if your AI system is coming from a part of the world where you have no jurisdiction, what do you do? Do we have some kind of laws that apply across the globe, and how are those enforced? If not, what are we going to be doing? Filtering within each nation for compliant systems, and that's maybe where we have to go, but that's another nightmare. So I just wanted to throw that out as long as we're losing sleep over all this stuff.
Yeah. No, yeah, that definitely makes it a lot more difficult. I think the EU is trying to tackle this by not allowing those parts of the product on the EU market. So there was a thing a while ago that certain Apple features were not allowed for European users. I don't remember what explicitly it was because I'm personally not an Apple user myself, but there were certain features of Apple not made available in the EU because they weren't compliant with EU laws. So I think slash hope that would be the case. That would be a push for these companies to alter their systems. And if they don't want to, then I, as a European citizen, am not sad about the products not being in the EU. But maybe that's just a little bit too idealistic for me.
No, I agree with you 100%. None of us, our lives are going to be threatened by the lack of these products, as far as I can tell.
Great. Anybody else with questions or comments? Mel notes in the comments that the Apple had to do with their proprietary payment system. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the other obvious ones is that in Japan, phones are required to make noises when
Yeah.
they take a photo, and that's something that they're able to implement these differently in different regions. And yeah, that's something we maybe see. We're seeing that already in the US with certain social media platforms, you're required to identify yourself. They're checking for age, and this is also bringing up questions of privacy concerns and also the motivations behind wanting to ID people and what the ultimate goal of some of these regulations are. So it's going to be a complicated topic. I think, yeah, it will be incumbent on individuals and organizations to like press and do some of the work for this. So yeah, like I mentioned, hopefully SWET can continue to find some experts on these topics and get some more information. Julia, yeah, go ahead.
I actually have a question myself.
Sure, yeah.
I don't know if that's allowed as the speaker, but
No, yeah.
so I know a lot about the European context. I know a little bit about the non-European context, but I was wondering if anyone knows like how this is in Japan. Are there any regulations regarding technology? Like you mentioned the phone sound, but do you know if there's anything else?
That's a really good question. I'm not up to date on it. I do know that I've seen a number of news reports recently where they're interviewing people about their chat GPT use. So it's starting to come into get mainstream recognition. Maybe as things are in Japan, maybe slightly a little bit delayed compared to some other areas. I know that, for example, the Facebook spread was came to Japan much later, around probably around 2012, which was a number of years after it's I think went to other countries. But the news reports I saw showed people using it for how they were supposed to engage with other people, like how should I respond to this person in this situation, things like that. But in terms of regulations, that's a good question. I do not have the answers there. Yeah. So that would be, maybe that's a topic that we can look into for another sweat talk for next year to see what the situation is. And then we can invite you to attend that and as an audience member this time.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be lovely.
Susan, yeah.
Definitely in academia, it's really hit or miss as to whether universities are embracing AI or not. Some universities have released statements saying that it's strictly forbidden, none of our researchers are allowed to use it, et cetera, et cetera. Other universities are more on the fence or more wishy-washy, saying whatever your professor says, and we actually value your ideas. We want our students to present their own ideas and our researchers to do their own work and their own calculations. But in the end, just do whatever your professor says. So we get these really wishy-washy comments from a lot of universities, perhaps even including my own. But I don't know of any like overarching regulatory constraints around the use of AI yet in Japan. That's a really
Mm.
great question.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. In
mm,
terms of universities, we do have a guideline at our university for AI use. So that's pretty interesting, maybe. This may be interesting to know. But that's more a guideline on which AI systems are like safe to use and whatnot. There's a little bit of a checklist system at my university for which systems are like privacy friendly, etc., and which the university allows you to use. Regarding teacher and students, we have some teachers who actively implement like ChatGPT in their exercises. Like for example, they have students generate an essay with ChatGPT, but then they have to audit it, pick out the flaws and correct it. Or they allow students to use generative AI, but they have to add a paragraph in the end, like a responsibility paragraph where they state that they're still the main author and I used ChatGPT for this and that, but I am still the main author, etc. So people are getting creative with it. That's pretty interesting to see in my university.
One thing that Mel shared in the chat, this is not quite regulations, but this is maybe represents Japan's new kind of position in the global content economy, which is publishers submitted a letter to a joint statement on October 31st after this Sora text to video app was released, saying that they were prepared to take legal action against copyright infringement. So clearly that struck a nerve, I think. Maybe the video that I mentioned with the Pokemon, but there was a big, right when that was released, and some of these image generators, there was a lot of people making Ghibli-esque cartoons with these generators. And so I do think Japan, given how much content is being coming from Japan and how careful some of these Japanese companies are with their copyrights, Japan could be in a strong position to influence how AI develops, I think.
Yeah, very interesting.
Great. On that note, I think We'll go ahead and thank Julia for spending her Sunday morning with us. I really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule over the last couple months to prepare this with us. And it was a really special experience, yeah, because SWET, again, we have a lot of really talented, smart writers and translators and editors, but we've really benefited from people like Mike and yourself to understand more about where we are in this current moment with artificial intelligence. And hopefully we can find some additional people to speak to us again.
Thank you all so much for spending your Sunday evening with me, or depending where you are, I think. But no, it was really nice being here and talking with you guys. I really enjoyed the discussion as well. So thank you.